The raven came at dusk, its wings heavy with rain and war. Robb Stark was standing over a map of the north when the maester placed the letter in his hand. The candles flickered, throwing shadows across his young face. A king's face, though he had never truly asked for a crown. Outside, the wind howled like a wounded wolf against the walls of River Run. He broke the seal. The message was short. The wall has fallen silent. The night's watch is failing. The dead are walking. Robb read it twice. His jaw tightened, but not in fear. In calculation. "Send for my mother," he said quietly, "and for my bannermen." But that was not the decision that would change the world. The real decision came later that night, when he stood alone beneath the open sky, staring north. Snow was beginning to fall. Early, too early. Winter was no longer coming. It was here. And for the first time since he was crowned king in the north, Robb did not think about the Lannisters. He thought about his brother, Jon Snow, the Bastard of Winterfell, the one who had taken the black, the one Robb had not seen since they were boys, sparring in the yard, laughing like war would never find them. By law, Jon was nothing. By blood, Robb did not care what blood said. Jon was his brother. The next morning, Robb made a choice that shocked his council. "We march north," he declared. There was uproar. The great Jon argued they should finish the war in the south. Roose Bolton's pale eyes narrowed in quiet disapproval. Even Catelyn Stark looked torn between pride and worry. "The Lannisters murdered your father," one lord reminded him, "and the dead will murder us all if we keep pretending the real war is over a throne." Robb replied. He stood tall then, not as a boy playing king, but as a man who had seen too much death already. "The North does not kneel," he said, "and it does not abandon its own." Word spread quickly. The young wolf was riding home. But the real storm was gathering at the wall. Jon Snow stood atop the icy battlements, staring into a forest that no longer felt empty. The wildlings had passed through. The night's watch was thin, tired, and divided. Some called him a traitor for letting the free folks south. Others called him a fool for trusting them. They did not see what he had seen. Hardhome, the dead rising in silence, blue eyes in the dark. Jon gripped the hilt of Longclaw and felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him. He had never wanted command either, yet here he was, trying to convince men who hated each other to stand together against something that did not care about their hatred. Then the horn sounded. Not once, not twice, 3 times, but this time it was not for White Walkers. It was for banners. From the top of the wall, Jon saw them, direwolves, stitched in gray and white, snapping in the wind. Thousands of men, northern men. At their head rode Robb Stark. For a moment, Jon thought he was dreaming, or dead. When the gates opened, the two brothers stood face to face for the first time in years. Robb looked older, harder. There was blood on his armor that had nothing to do with hunting. Jon looked colder, leaner, like the wall itself had carved him into something sharper. Neither spoke at first. Then Robb stepped forward and pulled him into an embrace. "I thought I lost you," Robb said quietly. "You're not rid of me that easily," Jon answered, though his voice broke just slightly. Around them, men watched in silence. The king in the north embracing a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. It was not political. It was not strategic. It was real. That night, they sat together in the Lord Commander's chambers, maps spread between them. Jon explained everything. The army of the dead, the Night King, the way steel shattered against ice, the way hope felt small against endless winter. Robb listened, and when Jon finished, expecting doubt or hesitation, Robb simply said, "Then we fight them together." Jon frowned. "The Watch is sworn to hold the wall. Your war is in the south. My war is wherever my people are dying," Robb replied. There it was again, that quiet steel. "But the Watch vows," Jon began, "are meant to protect the realm of men," Robb interrupted. "And I am part of that realm. You think I'll let my brother stand alone because of words spoken by men long dead?" Jon stared at him. In that moment something shifted. The North had always been strong, fierce, proud. But it had also been divided by oaths, by pride, by secrets. Now, for the first time, it felt united. Over the next weeks, Robb's army fortified the wall. Wildlings and northern lords stood side by side, awkward at first, then less so. The great Jon drank with Tormund. Northern Smith reforged weapons with dragon glass. Ravens flew south, calling every house loyal to the direwolf back home. Rose Bolton watched it all carefully. His face revealed nothing. But something dark moved behind his eyes. The Red Wedding never happened. Because Robb never returned south, and the Lannisters, expecting a weakened North bleeding itself dry in southern politics, did not see what was forming beyond the neck. An army not just of men, but of brothers. One night, as snow fell thick and silent, Jon and Robb stood together on the wall, staring into the endless white. "Do you think we can win?" Jon asked. Robb was quiet for a long time. "No," he said honestly, "but we can make them remember us." Jon almost smiled. Below them, torches burned. Wolves howled in the distance, and far beyond the trees, something moved. Watching. Winter had come, but this time, the North was ready. The first dead man they brought to Castle Black was a farmer from Last Hearth. They carried him through the gates at dawn, wrapped in frozen furs, his skin pale as milk and hard as stone. The Umbers had found him wandering near the tree line, alone, silent, eyes open but empty. No wounds, no blood, just death clinging to him like frost. Robb stood in the yard when they laid the body down. Jon was beside him. The northern lords gathered in a wide circle, their breath rising in clouds. "He froze?" one man muttered. Jon didn't answer. "Lock him in the ice cells," Jon ordered. "Chain the doors." There were whispers then. Fear, disbelief, even mockery from a few hardened soldiers who had not yet seen what waited beyond the wall. Robb said nothing, but he didn't leave. That night the screaming began. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint rattling of iron from below the Lord Commander's chambers. Then came the crash. The sound of splintering wood. A guard shouting. By the time Robb and Jon reached the cells, 3 men were already dead. The farmer stood in the corridor. His mouth hung open. His eyes burned blue. He moved fast, faster than any living man should. He lunged at a guard, teeth snapping, fingers clawing like broken branches. Jon stepped forward first, long claws slicing clean through the creature's neck. The head fell. The body kept moving. Robb didn't hesitate. He grabbed a torch from the wall and shoved it into the corpse's chest. Flames caught quickly. The smell was something none of them would ever forget. Only when the body turned to ash did the silence return. The northern lords were no longer whispering. Now they were afraid. Later, in the quiet of the chamber, Robb poured 2 cups of ale with hands that were steady, but only just. "You were right," he said. Jon didn't look pleased. "I wish I wasn't." Robb sat heavily. The men needed to see it. Now they'll believe. Jon stared into the fire. Belief isn't enough. And he was right. Because within days the dead began to gather. Scouts reported shapes moving between trees. Entire villages near the gift abandoned overnight. No blood, no survivors. Just silence and drag marks in the snow. The army forming in the forest did not shout war cries. It did not light campfires. It simply grew. Robb called a war council. The Great Jon demanded they ride out and meet the enemy in open battle. "We smashed them like any other army," he roared. "They don't break," Jon replied calmly. "They don't retreat, and every man we lose joins them." That silenced the room. "How many?" Robb asked. Jon hesitated. "Thousands, maybe more. And the White Walkers, I've seen at least one. There will be more." The room felt smaller suddenly. Roose Bolton finally spoke, his voice soft and smooth. "Then perhaps we should fall back. Regroup at Winterfell. Defend deeper ground." Robb's eyes hardened. If the wall falls, there is no deeper ground. That night, Robb walked alone along the top of the wall. The wind was sharp, biting at his face. He could see torchlight stretching for miles. His army, Jon's men, wildlings, all uneasy but standing together. Footsteps approached. Couldn't sleep either? Jon asked. Robb gave a faint smile. I keep thinking about father. Jon leaned against the frozen stone. He'd be proud. He'd tell me not to die foolishly. Jon's expression darkened. Then don't. Robb turned serious. If I fall, you lead. Jon immediately shook his head. You're the king in the north. And you're my brother, Robb said firmly. The men respect you. The wildlings follow you. If this war is about survival, not crowns, then it doesn't matter what they call us. Jon didn't answer. Because deep down, he knew something neither of them had spoken aloud. This war would not end cleanly. 3 nights later, the horns sounded again. 3 blasts. This time it was real. The forest moved. At first it looked like mist rolling through trees. Then shapes emerged. Hundreds, then thousands of them. Dead men, dead women, children, animals, all walking in terrible silence. At their center, riding pale horses, were figures like shards of ice, white walkers. The air itself seemed to freeze harder as they approached. Robb stood armored at the gate, sword drawn, Jon beside him. The northern banners snapped wildly in the rising wind. Loose, archers shouted, flaming arrows rained down. Some whites fell, burning. Many kept coming. They did not scream. They did not scream. They did not fear. They hit the wall like a wave against stone. Ladders rose. Frozen hooks bit into ice. Whites climbed over each other, breaking limbs and not caring. The battle became chaos. Wildlings fought beside Umbers. Knights from the Riverland stood shoulder to shoulder with Black brothers. The great Jon laughed like a madman as he crushed skulls. Tormund roared, axe swinging wildly. Jon faced a White Walker near the gate. Their blades met, ice against Valyrian steel. The sound rang out sharp and deadly. Jon barely held his ground. The Walker moved with unnatural grace, every strike precise. One wrong step, and Jon would join the army below. Then Robb was there. He drove his sword into the Walker's side. It shattered instantly. Ice exploded outward like glass. For a moment, everything froze. Then the whites nearby collapsed. The living stared in stunned silence. They can be killed, Robb breathed. But there were more, far more. And in the distance, watching from a ridge, stood a taller figure. Still, silent, the Night King. His blue eyes fixed on the 2 brothers standing side by side, as if measuring them, as if curious. The battle raged until dawn. Fire and steel and screams against endless cold. When the sun finally rose, the ground before the wall was covered in blackened bodies. But beyond the tree line, the army of the dead was still there, waiting. This was not their full strength. This was only a test, and both Jon and Robb knew it. Winter wasn't trying to break the wall, it was studying them. Morning did not bring relief. It only revealed the cost. The snow in front of the wall was no longer white. Ash mixed with blood, and smoke drifted in thin, ugly lines across the frozen field. Burned corpses lay in piles, some still twitching as stray embers finished their work. The smell of it clung to everything. Robb stood among the wounded in the courtyard. His armor was dented, his fur cloak torn, but he moved from man to man like he had done this his whole life. He knelt beside a young boy from House Mormont, barely old enough to shave, who had lost 2 fingers in the fighting. You held the line, Robb told him quietly. The North stands because of men like you. The boy tried to sit straighter despite the pain. Across the yard, Jon spoke with Tormund and the remaining Night's Watch officers. Their numbers had thinned badly. Too badly. Even with Robb's army reinforcing them, they could not survive another assault like that one. Not if it came at full strength. Jon looked toward the forest. The army of the dead had pulled back beyond bow range at sunrise. They were still visible, a dark scar stretching between the trees, waiting. They're not mindless, Jon said softly. They're patient. Robb joined him. Then we use that. Jon glanced sideways. How? We don't wait behind walls. That idea spread quickly, and it divided the camp just as quickly. At the War Council, voices rose again. You want to ride out? The Great Jon barked. Into that? Yes, Robb answered firmly. We strike their center. Kill as many White Walkers as we can before they're ready. Roose Bolton's pale eyes flickered. And if you fail? If you fall out there, your grace? Robb didn't flinch at the subtle emphasis on his title. Then the North falls fighting, he said simply. Jon stepped forward. He's right about one thing. We cannot let them choose the battlefield every time. But this isn't a Southern war. Glory won't win this. Then what will? Robb asked. Jon hesitated, then said something no one expected. Dragonglass is not enough. Valyrian steel kills them. We have 2 blades here, maybe 3 if we search the north. But that won't be enough. Silence filled the room. Daenerys Targaryen, Jon said at last. The name hung in the air like smoke. Some of the northern lords muttered in anger. A Targaryen, the daughter of the Mad King, the bloodline that burned their grandfather alive. She has dragons, Jon continued. Fire that could burn entire ranks at once. Robb's face tightened. And what would she want in return? The throne. Roose Bolton answered smoothly. Jon looked at Robb. This isn't about thrones. Robb held his gaze. It always becomes about thrones. That night, Robb could not sleep. He walked through the camps where wildlings and northern soldiers now shared fires. He heard laughter in some places, quiet prayers in others. He saw fear in nearly every face, but also something else. Unity. The North had never stood this closely with the free folk. Old hatred still lingered, but battle had blurred it. When death itself knocks at your gate, old grudges feel small. He stopped when he saw Jon standing alone again atop the wall. You're thinking about her, Robb said as he approached. Jon didn't deny it. If we send for Daenerys, Robb continued, we invite Southern politics back into the North. If we don't, Jon replied, we may not have a North left to protect. Robb exhaled slowly. The weight of a crown pressed harder now than it ever had in the South. There, war had been about revenge, about justice. Here it was survival. You would go? Robb asked. Jon nodded. If she refuses, we lose nothing. If she agrees, then we bend the knee. Jon didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he admitted. Robb studied his brother's face in the cold moonlight. Jon had always been the quiet one, the one who thought before speaking, the one who carried pain without complaint. You're more than a bastard of Winterfell, Robb said suddenly. Jon frowned. What? I don't know what father was hiding, Robb continued softly, but I know this. You were never less than me. Jon looked away, uncomfortable. Whatever happens, Robb said, we decide it together. No secrets, no divisions. Jon nodded once. Far beyond the wall. In the frozen dark, the Night King stood motionless. Around him, the White Walkers gathered in a silent circle. And then he lifted one hand. In the distant forest, shadows began to move again. But this time, they weren't heading toward Castle Black. They were turning east, toward the Shadow Tower, toward a weaker section of the wall, a feint, a trap. At dawn, a rider came galloping from the western watchposts, half frozen and barely able to speak. They're moving, he gasped. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Not here. Jon and Robb exchanged a look. They're splitting us, Jon realized. Robb's jaw tightened. Then we don't split. The decision was made quickly. Robb would take half the northern forces west to reinforce the Shadow Tower. Jon would remain at Castle Black to hold the main gate. For the first time since reuniting, the brothers would fight apart. In the courtyard, as men prepared to ride, Robb gripped Jon's forearm. Don't die, he said quietly. You first, Jon replied. There was no dramatic speech, no long farewell, just understanding. As Robb's army rode west under gray skies, snow began falling harder than before, and deep beneath the ice of the wall, something ancient stirred. Hairline cracks spread silently across frozen stone. The Night King was not just testing their strength. He was searching for weakness, and he had found one. The ride to the Shadow Tower felt longer than it should have. The wind howled across the open snowfields, biting through wool and steel alike. Robb rode at the front, gray wind racing ahead of the column, vanishing and reappearing like a ghost in the storm. The banners of the direwolf snapped violently behind them, half buried in falling snow. No songs were sung on that march. No one laughed, because the men could feel it. Something was wrong. Halfway there, the scouts returned with grim faces. "They're not attacking the Shadow Tower," one rider reported, struggling to catch his breath. "They're circling it, driving something south." "Driving what?" the Great Jon demanded. The scout swallowed. "The living." Robb's stomach tightened. "Villagers from the Gift." Villagers from the Gift. Wildling settlements that had only recently passed through the wall. Small holdfasts, thought too insignificant to defend. The army of the dead was not just attacking, it was harvesting. By the time Robb reached the Shadow Tower, smoke rose in thin black columns from distant fields. Through the blowing snow, he could see them. Lines of whites herding terrified survivors like cattle. Children, women, old men barely able to run. And behind them, on pale horses, the White Walkers watched with cold patience. "They want us to charge," one northern lord muttered. Robb's hands tightened around the reins. If they rushed blindly, they would be surrounded. If they waited, innocent people would die. This was the choice the Night King had crafted for him. War was no longer about territory. It was about mercy. "Form ranks," Robb ordered quietly. The Great Jon stared at him. "We can't just stand here." "We won't," Robb replied, "but we won't die foolishly either." He turned to his captains quickly, voice sharp and clear. "Archers on the ridge. Cavalry, wait for my signal. Infantry in shield wall formation. We punch through the center, straight for the walkers. Break them, and the dead fall." It was a gamble. If they failed to reach the White Walkers, they would be swallowed. Greywind growled low beside him, sensing the tension. Across the frozen field, a White Walker lifted its spear. The Whites surged forward. The battle exploded into motion. Arrows rained down first, cutting into the front ranks of the dead. But still they came, climbing over fallen bodies without hesitation. The sound of their movement was wrong, bones cracking, jaws snapping, 1,000 feet dragging through snow. "Now," Robb shouted. The cavalry charged. It felt like riding into a nightmare. Steel clashed with rotting flesh. Horses screamed as Whites dragged them down. Robb cut left and right, his sword rising and falling in brutal rhythm. Grey wind tore through limbs and throats, moving faster than the eye could follow. They reached the trapped villagers just as the dead began closing in from both sides. "Fall behind us," Robb roared. Some obeyed. Some were too slow. Robb saw a little girl stumble in the snow, a White reaching for her with frozen fingers. He didn't think. He turned his horse sharply, cutting the creature down inches from her face. He lifted the girl with one arm and shoved her toward a retreating soldier. "Run." Then the temperature dropped. It was sudden, violent. The wind died completely. Robb looked up. A White Walker stood directly ahead of him, tall and thin, armor gleaming like carved ice. Its blue eyes burned with ancient hatred. The battlefield seemed to quiet around them. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost curious. Then it attacked. The spear came fast, faster than any human strike. Robb barely deflected it, the impact numbing his arm. Frost spread instantly across his blade. He struck back, but his steel shattered on contact. For one terrifying heartbeat, he stood weaponless before something that did not breathe. The White Walker lunged, and then a roar split the air. Grey wind leapt, slamming into the creature's side. The force knocked it off balance just enough. Robb grabbed a fallen axe from the snow and swung with every ounce of strength he had. The blade connected with the walker's neck. It cracked, not fully, but enough. A spiderweb of fractures spread across its icy body. Robb screamed and struck again. This time the creature exploded into shards. All around them, dozens of Whites collapsed instantly. The living gasped in shock. But it was not enough. More White Walkers were advancing. 3 of them. 4. The dead did not stop. They pressed harder, forcing Robb's men into a tightening circle. Snow turned red beneath boots and claws. The rescued villagers were fleeing toward the Shadow Tower, but many would not make it. Robb realized the truth then. This was never about the villagers. It was about drawing him out, about weakening the Stark army, about testing the king in the north. Through the chaos, he saw one figure standing still atop a distant rise, the Night King, watching again, measuring. Robb felt anger rise in his chest. Not reckless anger, but something colder. "You want me?" he muttered under his breath. He grabbed a fallen spear and rallied the men around him. "Forward," he shouted. "We finish this now." They pushed as one. The north did not break. The great Jon carved a path like a beast unleashed. Northern shields locked tight. Gray wind tore through the flanks, and slowly, painfully, they drove the dead back, not because they were stronger, but because they were stronger, but because they refused to yield. After hours that felt like days, the remaining White Walkers retreated, melting into the storm. The Whites followed. The field fell silent except for the wounded. Robb stood trembling, bloodied but alive. They had saved many, but logged hundreds. As the survivors were brought inside the Shadow Tower, Robb stared at the horizon where the Night King had stood. This wasn't a full assault. It wasn't even close. It was pressure, testing both brothers separately, dividing them, and far away at Castle Black. Jon Snow had no idea what had just happened, because at that very moment, beneath the wall itself, the ice was beginning to crack, not from battle. From within, at Castle Black, the air felt wrong long before the cracking began. Jon woke before dawn, not from noise, but from silence, the kind of silence that presses against your ears until you realize something natural has stopped. No wind, no distant chatter from the yard. Not even the restless shifting of horses. He dressed quickly and stepped outside. Men stood scattered across the courtyard, staring north. No one spoke. Frost clung thick to the ground, heavier than it should have been. The wall itself seemed to groan, a low, deep sound that vibrated through stone and bone. Tormund approached him, red beard stiff with ice. "This is not good, Crow." Jon didn't answer. He felt it too. Then the horn blew. Not once, not twice, 3 times. But the sound didn't come from the forest. It came from below. A deafening crack split the morning air. The wall trembled violently, chunks of ice breaking loose and crashing into the courtyard in massive shards. Men scattered, shouting. Horses panicked. The ground beneath Jon's boots shifted. "They're not attacking the gates!" Someone screamed. Jon ran for the stairs, climbing 2 at a time despite the shaking beneath him. When he reached the top and looked down, his blood turned to ice. At the base of the wall, far below the usual range of sight, the Night King stood, alone, one hand raised, and beneath the wall's ancient ice, something dark pulsed like a spreading vein. Cracks were spreading upward from the foundation. "They're breaking it from the base," Jon shouted. "But how?" The wall was supposed to be more than ice. It was magic. Ancient spells woven into its core, protections laid down by men long dead. The Night King lowered his hand. The ground exploded. A section of the wall, not the tallest, not the strongest, but one of the older foundations, shattered outward in a violent cascade of ice and stone. It didn't collapse entirely, but it opened enough for the dead to begin climbing through the fractured base. Jon's heart pounded. This wasn't brute force, it was knowledge. The Night King had found a weakness. "Defend the breach," Jon roared. Chaos erupted. Whites poured through the shattered opening like ants from a broken nest. Hundreds at first, then thousands. They clawed over each other, crushing their own ranks just to reach the living. Jon met them head-on. Long Claw moved in flashing arcs, cutting through dead flesh. Every time Valyrian steel struck a White Walker who emerged from the breach, it shattered them, and dozens of Whites fell with them. But there were too many. Wildlings fought with desperate fury. Black brothers screamed oaths as they fell. The courtyard became a storm of steel and blood. Jon saw Sam dragged down by 3 Whites and cut them apart just in time. He saw Ed stabbed through the throat. He saw men he had trained with since boyhood torn apart. This wasn't a test like Robb's battle. This was an opening move. Above the chaos, the Night King finally stepped forward through the breach, not rushing, not shouting, just walking. The temperature dropped with every step he took. Jon locked eyes with him. Blue met gray. For a moment, everything else faded. The Night King tilted his head slightly, as if recognizing him. Then he raised both arms. Every fallen body in the courtyard began to shake. "No," Jon whispered. Men who had died moments ago opened their eyes. "Blue," they rose screaming, and then turned on their former brothers. The living line broke. Castle Black was no longer just a battlefield. It was a trap. Jon fought his way toward the breach, desperate to reach the Night King directly. If he could kill him here, maybe it would end. But White Walkers moved to block him, tall and silent, their icy blades cutting down anyone who came too close. Tormund fought like a madman beside him. "We cannot hold this." Jon knew it too. They were being overwhelmed. He made the hardest decision of his life. "Fall back," he shouted. "Evacuate south. Burn everything behind us." Some men hesitated. "This is the Night's Watch," one cried. Jon grabbed him. "If we stay, we die for nothing." The order spread reluctantly. Oil was poured, torches thrown, flames rose high against the cold. The retreat became a desperate scramble. Survivors fled through the southern gates as fire consumed what remained of Castle Black's lower structures. Jon was among the last to leave. He stood just beyond the burning breach and looked back once more. The Night King stood untouched in the flames, staring at him. Not angry, not rushed, certain. Jon felt it then. This was no random war. The Night King was hunting something. Someone. And as Jon turned and rode south with the remaining survivors, one terrible thought took shape in his mind. This was bigger than the wall. Bigger than the north. If Robb did not return soon, winter would swallow them piece by piece, and far to the west, riding back from the Shadow Tower with wounded and rescued villagers, Robb Stark saw smoke rising in the far distance. From Castle Black, Robb saw the smoke long before anyone else said it out loud. At first it looked like a dark line smudged against the gray sky. Then it thickened, rising in heavy columns that twisted with the wind. Castle Black. His chest tightened. "No," he whispered under his breath. He spurred his horse forward without waiting for orders. The men followed instantly. Gray wind raced ahead, howling as if he already knew. The closer they rode, the colder it became. Not natural cold, but something deeper. The kind that sinks into your bones and doesn't leave. By the time they reached the outer hills overlooking Castle Black, Robb's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. The wall still stood, but part of it was broken. A massive scar carved into its base, blackened by fire. The courtyard below was still smoldering. Bodies lay scattered in the snow, and there was no banner flying. "Gods," one of his captains murmured. Robb didn't wait. He rode down hard toward the ruins. As they entered the burned remains of the courtyard, they found signs of a fighting retreat: oil barrels smashed, drag marks in the snow, bodies burned beyond recognition. But not all were burned. Some corpses lay twisted in unnatural shapes, blue frost still clinging to their faces. Whites. Which meant Jon had fought. Which meant Jon might still be alive. Robb dismounted and knelt beside a fallen black brother. The man's sword was snapped in half. His eyes were closed. Robb closed them gently. Then he heard it. A horn blast. Single. Short. From the south. Alive. Robb turned sharply. "Move." They followed the sound for nearly a mile beyond the wall's southern side until they found them, a battered line of survivors regrouping near a frozen stream. Jon stood at their center, blood streaked across his face, Longclaw still in hand. For a split second, neither brother moved. Then Robb crossed the distance and pulled Jon into a rough embrace. "You're alive," Robb breathed. "Barely," Jon answered. Relief lasted only a moment. "How bad?" Robb asked. Jon's expression darkened. "They broke the wall." Robb's jaw clenched. "I can see that." "No," Jon said quietly. "You don't understand. They didn't just breach it. They broke its magic. The spells, they're gone in that section." Robb felt something cold settle in his chest. That meant the wall was no longer an unbreakable barrier. It was just ice. How many? Robb asked. Jon looked at the thinning line of survivors. Half, maybe less. Robb closed his eyes briefly. This was no longer about holding a defensive line. The Night King had crossed into the north. They were fighting on their own soil now. We fall back to Winterfell, Robb said. Jon didn't argue. There was nothing left to defend at Castle Black. The march south was grim and silent. Villages along the way were already abandoned. Doors hung open, hearths cold. In some places there were signs of struggle. In others, nothing, which was worse. Scouts brought worse news each day. The dead were not moving fast. They were moving carefully, almost strategically. They avoided strong positions. They swept through smaller settlements first, growing their numbers, expanding slowly like frost across glass. They're hurting us, Jon muttered one night as they camped beneath bare trees. Toward Winterfell, Robb finished. Winterfell, heart of the north. Symbol of Stark power. If it fell, morale would shatter. And the Night King knew it. As they rode through the gates of Winterfell days later, the familiar sight did little to ease the dread hanging over them. The great walls stood firm, the Stark banners flew proudly, but fear had arrived before they had. Refugees filled the courtyard. Women clutched children. Old men sharpened farm tools into weapons. Robb wasted no time. Send ravens, he ordered, to every northern house, to White Harbor, to Bear Island, to the Vale, to anyone who owes us loyalty. Jon added quietly, and to Dragonstone. Robb hesitated only a second. Then he nodded. If dragons were the only fire hot enough to slow this winter, pride would not stop him. That night, the brothers stood in the God's Wood beneath the heart tree. Snow fell softly around them. I failed, Jon said suddenly. Robb turned sharply. You held as long as you could. I should have seen it, the weakness in the wall. You're not a god, Robb replied firmly. You're a man, and you're still standing. Jon looked toward the carved face of the weirwood tree. He looked at me. Who? The Night King. Like he knew me. Robb didn't like the sound of that. He wants something, Jon continued. This isn't random destruction. Robb placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Then we make Winterfell the place he regrets coming. But even as he said it, both of them knew the truth. Winterfell had strong walls, but walls alone would not save them. In the far distance, beyond the tree line, the first blue lights began appearing again in the dark. Slow, steady, coming south. Winterfell had never felt so full. Every hall, every corridor, every stable was crowded with bodies. Refugees slept beside armored knights. Wildlings sharpened spears next to northern lords who once would have refused to stand in the same room with them. Fear had flattened pride. Snow fell constantly now, thick and endless. It covered the battlements, the roofs, the godswood. It buried the outer fields in white silence. And beyond that silence, the blue lights grew closer each night. Robb stood in the great hall before a sea of northern banners. Mormont, Umber, Karstark, Glover. Even a few from the Vale had answered the call. Not enough, but more than he had hoped. Jon stood at his side. This is our home, Robb said, his voice steady but heavy. Our fathers built these walls. Our mothers walked these yards. If we fall defending the north. Together. A roar answered him, not joyful but fierce. Jon stepped forward after him. They don't fear death, he said plainly. They don't feel pain, and they will use our dead against us. Burn every fallen body, no matter who it is. That part was harder for the men to accept, but they nodded. They had seen enough. Later that night, a horn sounded from the watchtower. Not 3 blasts, just one long, low note. They were here. From the battlements, Robb and Jon watched the army of the dead stretch across the fields beyond Winterfell. It was larger than before, much larger. Tens of thousands now. Maybe more. At their center, pale and silent, stood the White Walkers. And at the front, on his lifeless horse, the Night King. He had not rushed him. He had grown stronger with every mile south. "He wants this," Jon murmured. Robb nodded. "Then we give him a fight he'll never forget." The battle began at dusk. Flaming trenches were lit around Winterfell's outer perimeter. Archers loosed arrows into the advancing mass. Firelight flickered wildly across the snow. For a moment, it seemed to work. The front ranks of whites burned, collapsed, stumbled, then the dead behind them kept walking. They filled the trenches with their own bodies, smothering the flames beneath sheer weight. They climbed over each other without hesitation, breaking limbs and rising again. "They don't stop," someone whispered. The first wave hit the outer lines like a storm. The clash was brutal and immediate. Shields splintered. Swords hacked uselessly at limbs that kept moving even after being severed. The air filled with screams, living and dead. Jon fought at the main gate, Longclaw glowing faintly in the firelight. Every time he struck a White Walker, shards of ice burst outward and dozens of whites fell. But there were always more. Robb commanded from horseback near the center, rallying collapsing lines, plugging gaps before they widened. Gray wind tore through enemies like a shadow given teeth. Hours passed in chaos. The courtyard fell first, then the outer wall. The fighting retreated inward. "Fall back to the keep," Robb shouted. Bodies were burned as quickly as possible, but not quickly enough. The Night King lifted his arms again, and Winterfell's dead rose. Men who had fallen defending their home turned with blue eyes and attacked their own kin. The line shattered. Inside the Godswood, Jon found himself suddenly alone. Snow fell softly between the ancient trees, and there he was. The Night King stepped forward slowly, sword of ice forming in his hand. This time, there were no armies between them, no distractions, just silence. Jon tightened his grip on Longclaw. "You want me," he said quietly. The Night King did not answer. He attacked. The clash was violent. Ice met Valyrian steel in ringing strikes that echoed through the Godswood. Jon moved fast, but the Night King was faster. Every blow felt heavier than the last. Jon stumbled back, barely blocking a killing strike that split the bark of the heart tree behind him. Across the yard, Robb saw the flash of ice. He saw Jon fall to one knee, and he didn't think. He charged straight into the Godswood, cutting through whites in a blind rush. The Night King raised his blade for the final strike. Robb tackled him from the side. Both crashed into the snow. For a brief second, the Night King looked surprised. Robb swung his sword, but it shattered instantly against the creature's armor. The Night King grabbed Robb by the throat and lifted him effortlessly. Jon forced himself up, pain screaming through his body. He drove Longclaw forward with everything he had left. The blade pierced the Night King's side. The creature froze. Cracks spread slowly across his icy skin, but he did not shatter. Instead, he looked at Jon again, and for the first time, he smiled. A terrible, knowing smile. Then he exploded outward in a blast of ice that threw both brothers across the Godswood. The whites did not fall. The White Walkers did not break. The Night King reformed slowly from the swirling frost. Stronger. The realization hit Jon like a blade. Killing him wasn't that simple. This wasn't just a leader of the dead. This was something older, something tied to magic far deeper than steel. The Night King raised his hand again, and every fallen Stark soldier in the courtyard began to rise. Winterfell was falling, and for the first time, Robb Stark felt true doubt creep into his heart. Snow covered everything. The screams, the blood, the broken stones of Winterfell. Jon forced himself to breathe as he pushed up from the frozen ground. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. Across the Godswood, Robb was struggling to stand as well, frost clinging to his armor. The Night King stood between them, untouched, unbroken. Around the castle, the dead were rising again. Northern soldiers, wildlings, even boys who had barely held a sword for the first time that night. Winterfell was no longer just a battlefield. It was becoming part of the army against them. Jon's mind raced. Steel alone wasn't enough. He had pierced the Night King. He had cracked him. But something had allowed him to return, something binding him to this world. "The magic," Jon muttered. Robb staggered to his feet. "What?" "The wall had magic in it. Old magic. The children of the forest. The Night King broke it. The heart tree behind them creaked softly in the wind, red leaves trembling. Jon's eyes shifted toward it. The weirwood. Old magic still lived here. The Night King began walking toward them again, slow and certain. He was not rushing. He knew they were weakening. Robb grabbed a fallen spear, even knowing it would likely shatter. "We don't have time for riddles, Jon." Jon looked at the heart tree's carved face, ancient, watching. Then something clicked. "When the children created him," Jon said quickly, "they tied him to the magic of the land, to the weirwoods." Robb frowned. "You're guessing." "Yes," Jon said honestly, "but we're out of better options." The Night King lunged. Robb met him first this time, distracting him, even knowing he could not win alone. Ice met splintering wood. Robb was thrown back hard against the roots of the tree. Jon sprinted past them. He didn't attack the Night King. He drove Longclaw straight into the heart of the weirwood. The blade sank deep into pale bark. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the tree began to bleed, thick red sap pouring down over the steel. The ground trembled. The Night King froze mid-strike. His blue eyes flickered. Cracks began spreading across his body again, deeper this time, spreading from his chest outward like fractures in glass. He turned slowly toward Jon, and for the first time, there was something in his face that looked almost like fear. The storm above Winterfell intensified. Wind roared through the courtyard. The remaining White Walkers screamed, a high, unnatural sound that pierced the air. Jon gripped Longclaw and twisted it deeper into the tree. The carved face of the heart tree seemed to weep more heavily, red sap pouring over his hands. The Night King staggered. Robb saw it. He didn't hesitate. With a roar that tore from somewhere deep in his chest, he grabbed a broken shard of Valyrian steel, a fragment from Longclaw chipped in battle, and charged. The Night King tried to raise his blade. He was slower now. Robb drove the shard straight into the spreading crack in the Night King's chest. For one suspended second, everything went silent. Then the Night King shattered, not in an explosion, but in a collapse. His body broke apart into fine ice that scattered across the snow like dust in the wind. Across Winterfell, every White Walker burst into shards, and every white fell lifeless. Just still. The storm stopped. The wind died. Only silence remained. Jon fell to his knees in the snow, hands still gripping Longclaw embedded in the bleeding heart tree. Robb stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the place where the Night King had stood moments before. It was over. Slowly, survivors began emerging from corners of the castle. Wounded, exhausted, shocked, they looked at the fallen dead around them, no longer moving. The North had survived, but barely. Dawn broke pale and quiet over Winterfell. Smoke rose gently from burned bodies outside the walls. The cost was impossible to measure. Too many banners would never fly again. In the Godswood, Jon carefully pulled Longclaw free from the heart tree. The bleeding slowed, though the carved face seemed somehow older now. Robb approached him. "You were right," Robb said quietly. Jon shook his head. "We both were." They stood in silence for a while. "We lost too many," Robb finally said. "Yes, but we're still here." Jon looked out over Winterfell, scarred but standing. "The North is still here." Word spread quickly across the realm. The army of the dead was gone. The long night had ended before it could swallow the world. And something else spread too. A new understanding. The North had stood united. Wildlings and lords, brothers and bastards, king and commander. No red wedding had divided them. No southern throne had distracted them. They had chosen each other over crowns. Weeks later, as ravens flew carrying news of victory, Robb stood once more before his gathered lords in the great hall. "The North will remain independent," he declared. "Not to rule others, not to chase power, but to protect our own." There were no arguments. They had all seen what nearly destroyed them. After the hall emptied, Robb found Jon in the courtyard. "You could rule beside me," Robb said. "Not as Lord Commander, Not as a bastard, as my brother. Jon gave a small, tired smile. I never wanted a crown. Neither did I. They both laughed softly at that. The snow was lighter now, the sky clearer. Winter had come, but it had not won. And as the Stark banners flew over Winterfell once more, the North remembered something important. When wolves stand together, even the longest night can be broken.